The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the cramped BBC Africa studio in Ouagadougou, casting harsh shadows across the worn carpet.
Sarah Mitchell adjusted her earpiece for the third time, her palms slightly damp despite the air conditioning that barely worked in Burkina Faso's sweltering heat. 23 years of journalism had taken her from war zones in Syria to political upheavals in Myanmar, but something about today felt different. The anticipation in the air was almost tangible, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Captain Ibrahim Traore was scheduled to arrive in 15 minutes. The 34-year-old military leader who had seized power in Burkina Faso's second coup within 8 months was known for his unpredictability. Some called him a visionary, others a dangerous populist. Sarah had spent weeks securing this interview, the first major international sit-down since his rise to power. Her editor in London had been clear: get him to talk about the French military presence, the Wagner Group rumors, and his plans for democracy.
Simple and on paper.
Marcus, her cameraman, was testing the equipment for the 4th time. His nervous energy was infectious, and Sarah found herself checking her notes again. She had covered dictators and presidents, but Traoré was an enigma wrapped in military fatigues. Intelligence reports suggested he was highly educated, spoke multiple languages fluently, and had an almost photographic memory for geopolitical details. Yet he also commanded the loyalty of soldiers who had grown tired of foreign interference and corruption. The sound of vehicles approaching made everyone in the small studio tense. Through the window, Sarah could see a convoy of pickup trucks with heavily armed soldiers.
No fanfare, no diplomatic protocol.
This was how Traoré traveled, they had been told. Like a man who trusted no one completely but commanded respect through presence rather than ceremony. The studio door opened, and he walked in alone. Ibrahim Traoré was smaller than Sarah had expected, maybe 5'8", but he carried himself with the confidence of someone much larger. He wore simple military fatigues, no medals or decorations, just the insignia of his rank. His eyes swept the room methodically, taking in every camera angle, every potential exit, every face present. When his gaze settled on Sarah, she felt as though she was being X-rayed. "Ms. Mitchell," he said in perfect English, his accent carrying traces of French education and local dialect. "I have heard you ask difficult questions." "Good. I prefer difficult questions to easy lies." Sarah stood to shake his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, and he held eye contact longer than was comfortable. "Captain Traoré, thank you for agreeing to this interview."
"I know your time is valuable."
"Time," he repeated, as if the word held special meaning. "Yes, time is the only currency that matters now."
"Shall we begin?"
The interview started conventionally enough. Sarah asked about his background, his vision for Burkina Faso, the challenges of governance. Traoré answered thoughtfully, sometimes pausing for long moments before speaking. His responses were articulate and measured, but there was something underneath, a current of tension that made Sarah increasingly aware that she was not conducting a typical political interview. 15 minutes in, she decided to probe deeper. "Captain, there are allegations that your government has been in contact with Russian military contractors. Can you address these concerns about foreign influence?" Traoré's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to think carefully about your next question. Not because I am threatening you, but because I want you to understand something that your colleagues in Western media often miss." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't the response she had expected. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. You come here with questions written by editors in London, based on intelligence briefings from agencies that have never set foot in a Burkinabe village. You ask about Russian contractors as if the presence of French troops for decades was somehow natural law. You speak of foreign influence while representing a media organization that has shaped narratives about Africa for a century.
Do you see the contradiction?"
The directness of his response caught Sarah off guard. She had interviewed politicians who deflected, who gave non-answers, who spun. But Traoré was doing something different. He was turning the interview inside out, making her the subject of examination. "Captain, I'm simply asking about documented concerns raised by regional experts and international observers," she replied, trying to regain control of the conversation. Traoré smiled, but there was no warmth in it.
Regional experts.
"Tell me, Ms. Mitchell, how many languages do you speak?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. "I'm sorry." "Languages. How many do you speak fluently?"
Sarah hesitated.
"English, obviously. Some French, basic Arabic from my time in the Middle East." "I speak 7 languages fluently," Traoré said quietly. "More, Dioula, French, English, Arabic, Russian, and Mandarin. I studied at military academies in France and Russia. I have read Marx and Sankara, Adam Smith and Confucius. I understand geopolitics not from briefing papers but from living it. So when you ask me about Russian influence, understand that I am not some village strongman who stumbled into power." Sarah felt the interview slipping away from her. This was not going according to plan, but she pressed on. "With respect, Captain, your education doesn't address the concerns about democratic governance and—" "Democratic governance," Traoré interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge that made Marcus adjust his camera angle nervously. "Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. How many democratically elected African leaders has the West supported when those leaders acted against Western economic interests?"
The question hung in the air.
Sarah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. She could feel the interview shifting into territory she wasn't prepared for. "I can see you thinking," Traoré continued. "The answer is 0. Patrice Lumumba was democratically elected. Thomas Sankara was beloved by his people. But they threatened the wrong interests. Democracy, for Africa, has always been conditional on Western approval. So forgive me if I find your concern about democratic governance somewhat selective." Sarah felt sweat beginning to form on her forehead despite the air conditioning. She had interviewed authoritarian leaders before, but none had dismantled her questions so systematically. "Captain, surely you understand that international observers have legitimate concerns about—"
International observers.
Traoré's voice was getting quieter, which somehow made it more menacing. "Ms. Mitchell, do you know what the median age is in Burkina Faso?"
Another curveball. Sarah shook her head.
17 years old.
17.
Half my population was born into a world where French troops were stationed here, where our uranium made other nations rich while our people remained poor, where our young men had no choice but to flee to Europe or join militant groups because there were no opportunities at home. These international observers you mention, they observed our poverty for decades. They observed our exploitation. They observed foreign corporations extracting our resources while our children went hungry. Where was their concern then? The force of his words was like a physical presence in the room. Sarah could see Marcus wiping sweat from his brow, and she realized that what had started as an interview was becoming something else entirely.
A reckoning.
"Now," Traoré continued, "when we decide to chart our own course, suddenly there is international concern. When we ask why French companies control our gold mines while our people dig with their hands, suddenly we are undemocratic. When we question why our former colonial masters still dictate our economic policies, suddenly we are dangerous." Sarah tried to interject. "Captain, no one is questioning your right to sovereignty, but—" Traoré's eyebrows raised slightly. "There it is. The word that negates everything before it. We support your sovereignty, but we respect your independence, but we believe in your right to self-determination, but—" That word, Ms. Mitchell, that "but" is the sound of chains rattling. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked at her notes, but the questions she had prepared suddenly seemed irrelevant, almost insulting. She was dealing with someone who had clearly thought deeply about these issues, who was operating on a level of analysis that her briefing papers hadn't prepared her for. "Let me ask you a question now," Traoré said, settling back in his chair. "What do you know about the Sahel region's gold reserves?"
Sara blinked.
Some. It's one of the reasons for the international interest in stability here." "Some," Traoré repeated. "The Sahel contains some of the world's largest untapped gold reserves. Burkina Faso alone has an estimated 15 million ounces of gold reserves. At current prices, that's roughly $30 billion. Now, guess how much of that wealth has remained in Burkina Faso over the past 50 years? Sarah didn't answer. She was beginning to understand that every question was a trap, not in a malicious sense, but in the sense that her ignorance was being systematically exposed. "Less than 5%, Traoré answered his own question. 5% of our own wealth stayed in our own country. The rest?
London, Paris, Toronto.
Mining companies with shareholders who have never set foot in Africa became billionaires while Burkinabe children suffered from malnutrition.
This is what your international observers observed.
This is what they found acceptable." The room felt smaller now, claustrophobic. Sarah realized that everyone present, from Marcus to the sound technician to the local producer, was hanging on every word. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a masterclass in how power dynamics actually worked. "So when you ask me about Russian contractors," Traoré continued, "what you're really asking is why I won't maintain the system that has impoverished my people for generations. When you express concern about democratic governance, what you're really expressing is concern that we might actually govern for our people rather than for foreign interests." Sarah felt compelled to push back. "Captain, with all due respect, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence that Western governments deliberately—" "Evidence?" Traoré laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Ms. Mitchell, the evidence is in every development index, every economic statistic, every migration pattern for the past 60 years. The evidence is in the fact that countries with no natural resources somehow develop faster than countries with abundant resources. The evidence is in the military bases, the trade agreements, the debt structures that keep us perpetually dependent." He leaned forward again, his intensity filling the space between them.
"But you want documents, don't you? Smoking guns, recorded conversations."
"Because your journalism has been trained to look for scandal rather than system. You investigate individual corruption while ignoring institutional exploitation." Sarah felt her professional confidence crumbling. She had spent decades learning how to conduct interviews, how to ask tough questions, how to hold power accountable. But Traoré was demonstrating that her entire framework was inadequate to the reality he was describing. "Let me give you some evidence," Traoré said.
"The CFA franc."
"Do you know what that is?" Sarah nodded weakly. "The currency used by many former French colonies." "Correct. And do you know how it works?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. "The CFA franc is guaranteed by the French Treasury." Sounds generous, doesn't it? But here's what that really means. Half of our foreign reserves must be deposited in the French Treasury. We cannot access our own money without French approval. We cannot devalue our currency to make our exports competitive. We cannot pursue independent monetary policy. 14 African countries are locked into a monetary system that serves French interests first. The implications were staggering, and Sarah realized that her ignorance of this basic fact undermined any credibility she might have had in questioning Traoré's policies. "This is not conspiracy theory, Ms. Mitchell. This is publicly available information. You could have researched it before coming here. But your editors didn't brief you on it, did they? Because acknowledging how the CFA franc works would mean acknowledging that French colonial control never actually ended." Sarah felt exposed, unprepared, and increasingly aware that she was out of her depth. But journalist instincts kicked in, and she tried to regain some initiative. Even if these systems are problematic, Captain, doesn't that make international cooperation and reform more important rather than reform? Traore's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Ms. Mitchell, how long should my people wait for reform? My generation is the fourth generation to hear promises of reform. We have reformed our governments, reformed our institutions, reformed our policies. We have held elections, established transparency measures, fought corruption. And yet, somehow, our resources still flow outward while our people remain poor. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah could hear the air conditioning struggling, the distant sound of traffic outside, the almost imperceptible hum of the recording equipment. You know what we haven't reformed? Traoré continued. The fundamental relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. The assumption that our resources belong to whoever can extract them most efficiently. The presumption that our markets should be open to foreign goods while our goods face barriers in foreign markets. The belief that our development should follow models designed by people who have never lived our reality. Sarah struggled to find a response that wouldn't sound naive or rehearsed. But surely, Captain, isolation isn't the answer.
Global interconnection.
Who said anything about isolation? Traoré's response was sharp.
We want connection, Ms. Mitchell.
We want trade, investment, technological exchange, cultural dialogue. What we don't want is subordination. What we don't want is to remain the raw material supplier for everyone else's prosperity. He stood up suddenly, and for a moment Sarah thought the interview was over. But instead, he moved to the window and looked out at the street below. Do you see those young men out there? He asked, pointing to a group gathered near a street vendor. 3 of them have university degrees. One studied engineering, another studied computer science. But there are no jobs for engineers or computer scientists here because all the technical work is done by foreign contractors who bring their own people. So these educated young men sell phone cards and motorcycle parts to survive. Sarah followed his gaze and saw the scene he was describing. Young men in their 20s and 30s, some well-dressed despite their circumstances, gathered around small-scale commerce. Now, Traoré continued, when these young men try to migrate to Europe for opportunities, they are called economic migrants and turned away. When they stay here and become frustrated with their circumstances, they are called potential terrorists and surveilled. When they demand that their government create opportunities for them, they are called unrealistic populists. Tell me, Ms. Mitchell, what exactly are they supposed to do? The question was rhetorical, but it hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had reported on migration crises, on youth unemployment, on radicalization, but always as separate issues. Traoré was connecting them into a single narrative of systematic exclusion. This is why I find your questions about democracy and governance so interesting, Traoré said, returning to his seat. You concern yourself with process while ignoring outcomes. You worry about whether our elections meet international standards while ignoring that our educated youth have no future. You analyze our institutional structures while our children remain malnourished. Sarah felt the conversation spiraling further away from anything she could control or predict. She decided to try a more direct approach.
Captain, what do you want?
What is your endgame? For the first time, Traoré smiled genuinely.
A simple question.
I appreciate simple questions. I want what every leader should want, for my people to prosper in their own country.
I want Burkinabe engineers to build Burkinabe infrastructure.
I want Burkinabe farmers to feed Burkinabe families profitably. I want Burkinabe students to solve Burkinabe problems with world-class education and resources. And you believe this requires rejecting Western partnership? I believe this requires rejecting Western dominance, Traoré corrected. There is a difference, though I understand why that distinction might be difficult for your audience to grasp. Sarah felt stung by the implication. "Captain, I think you're underestimating." "Am I?"
Traore interrupted. Messe Mitchell, let me ask you something personal.
"How much do you know about your own country's relationship with Africa?"
Sarah hesitated.
"I've covered African affairs for several years." "That's not what I asked. I asked what you know about Britain's relationship with Africa. Not as a journalist covering events, but as a citizen understanding history." The distinction was subtle but important, and Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. "Britain currently has military agreements with 14 African countries," Traoré continued. "British companies control mining operations in 23 African countries. British banks handle the finances for resource extraction across the continent. British schools train African elites who return home to implement British-designed policies." "This is not historical fact, Ms. Mitchell.
This is present reality.
Sarah felt increasingly uncomfortable, not because Traoré was being hostile, but because his information was so comprehensive and her knowledge so superficial by comparison. "Now," Traoré continued, "when someone like me suggests that maybe, just maybe, African resources should primarily benefit African people, this gets labeled as anti-Western extremism. When I suggest that African problems might require African solutions, this gets called dangerous nationalism. Do you see the bind we're in?" The bind was becoming clear to Sarah, but admitting it would mean acknowledging that her entire professional approach to covering Africa had been fundamentally flawed. "Let me give you a concrete example," Traoré said. "Burkina Faso has some of the world's best cotton growing conditions. We could produce high-quality cotton, process it into textiles, and manufacture clothing. This would create jobs at every level of the value chain and generate significant revenue for our economy." Sarah nodded, waiting for the catch. "But," Traoré continued, "international trade agreements negotiated by our previous governments require us to export raw cotton at commodity prices and import finished textiles at retail prices. We are contractually obligated to remain suppliers of raw materials. When we try to change these agreements, we are told we are violating international law." The absurdity was stark when stated so plainly. Sarah realized that she had never questioned why African countries remained exporters of raw materials despite having the capacity for value-added processing. "So when you ask me about my plans for democracy," Traoré said, "understand that democracy without economic sovereignty is just performance. We can hold elections, but if we cannot control our own economic destiny, what exactly are we voting for?"
The question lingered in the air.
Sarah found herself thinking about democratic theory in ways she had never considered before. What did political freedom mean without economic freedom? "Captain," she said carefully, "these are complex issues with no easy solutions. Surely gradual reform within existing international frameworks." "Gradual reform," Traoré repeated slowly. "Ms. Mitchell, my people have been gradually reforming for 60 years. We have gradually reformed ourselves into deeper poverty while our resources gradually made other people richer. At what point does gradual reform become perpetual submission?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She realized that every response she offered was being systematically deconstructed, not through hostility but through superior knowledge and clearer analysis. "Let me ask you something," Traoré said. "Do you believe that African people are inherently less capable than other people?" Sarah was taken aback. "Of course not. No, absolutely not." "Good. I'm glad to hear that. Because if African people are just as capable as everyone else, then our poverty is not natural.
It's artificial.
It's maintained by systems that benefit from our poverty. And those systems will not reform themselves out of goodness of heart." The logic was unassailable, and Sarah found herself nodding despite feeling that she was conceding ground she didn't want to concede. "This is why your questions about my legitimacy are so interesting to me," Traoré continued. "The previous government was democratically elected, and it presided over continued impoverishment while foreign companies extracted billions in resources. My government came to power through military action, but we are actually implementing policies that benefit our people. Which government is more legitimate? Sarah opened her mouth to respond about democratic process and rule of law, but the words seemed hollow before she could speak them. I see you thinking, Traoré observed. You're thinking about process versus outcomes, about legality versus legitimacy,
About theory versus reality.
These are good things to think about. Sarah felt like she was in a philosophy seminar rather than a news interview. But she also felt like she was learning something important, something that challenged her fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. Let me tell you what I think about when I make decisions, Traoré said. I think about the 17-year-old girl who walks 5 kilometers to fetch water because international development aid built wells that broke down after 2 years and were never repaired. I think about the university graduate who drives a motorcycle taxi because the structural adjustment programs eliminated government jobs and no private sector developed to replace them. I think about the farmer who grows food he cannot afford to eat because he must sell everything to pay debts to foreign seed companies. Each example was specific, personal, human. Sarah realized that while she had been asking about geopolitical strategy, Traoré was thinking about individual lives. These are the people I serve, Traoré continued. Not international observers, not Western media, not foreign investors. These are the people whose interests I must put first. If that makes me undemocratic in your analysis, so be it. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was not just interviewing a political leader, she was representing a worldview that was being systematically challenged. And she was not sure she could defend that worldview effectively. Captain, she said, trying one more approach, even if your analysis is correct, even if the current systems are unjust, don't you risk isolating Burkina Faso from the international community? Doesn't that hurt your people in the long run? Traoré laughed, but again it was not a pleasant sound. Isolating ourselves from the international community. Ms. Mitchell, we are already isolated. We are isolated from the benefits of international trade. We are isolated from the profits of our own resources. We are isolated from meaningful participation in global decisions that affect us. The only thing we are not isolated from is the costs and obligations imposed by others. Sarah felt like she was drowning in the depth of his analysis. Every angle she tried to pursue led to the same conclusion, that the existing system was designed to benefit everyone except the people it claimed to help. But what about the risks? She pressed. Economic disruption, political instability, regional conflicts? You mean the risks of change, Traoré said. What about the risks of not changing? What about the risk that another generation of African youth will grow up without opportunities? What about the risk that our resources will continue flowing outward while our people remain poor? What about the risk that the current system will generate more conflict, more migration, more desperation? Sarah realized that she had been framing risk in only one direction, as if maintaining the status quo was somehow safe while change was dangerous. But Traoré was pointing out that the status quo was itself extremely risky for his people. Let me ask you this, Traoré continued. If the current system was working for African people, would we be having this conversation? Would there be military coups across the Sahel? Would there be massive migration to Europe? Would there be growing support for radical alternatives? The questions were rhetorical, but they forced Sarah to confront the fact that what she had been taught to see as stability was actually systemic failure from the perspective of the people most affected. The instability you worry about, Traoré said, it's already here. It's been here for decades. The only difference is that now we are choosing our own form of instability rather than accepting the instability imposed on us by others. Sarah looked at her notes one more time, but she realized that the interview had moved far beyond the questions she had prepared. She was no longer asking about policy positions or governance structures. She was being educated about the fundamental realities of global power dynamics. "Captain," she said finally, "what would you say to people who believe that your approach is too radical, too risky, too confrontational?" Traoré was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah thought he might be finished. But when he spoke again, his voice was softer, more reflective. "I would say that radical times require radical solutions. I would say that when conventional approaches have failed for 60 years, perhaps it's time to try something different. I would say that the greatest risk is not taking risks at all." He paused, then continued. "But mostly, Ms. Mitchell, I would say that what seems radical from London or Paris looks like common sense from Ouagadougou. What seems confrontational to people who benefit from the current system looks like self-defense to people who suffer under it." Sarah found herself nodding. Not because she agreed with everything Traoré had said, but because she could no longer ignore the internal logic of his position. "You know what is truly radical?" Traoré asked. "The idea that African people should remain poor forever so that other people can remain rich. The idea that we should accept permanent subordination as the price of international acceptance. The idea that our resources belong to whoever can take them rather than to the people who live above them." Sarah felt the conversation coming to a natural conclusion, but she wasn't sure how to end it. She had come to ask questions, but she felt like she had been the one being questioned and found wanting. "Ms. Mitchell," Traoré said, seeming to sense her confusion, "I want you to understand something.
I am not anti-Western.
I am not anti-democratic. I am not even anti-capitalist. But I am pro-African.
I am pro-Burkinabe.
I believe that my people deserve the same opportunities, the same prosperity, the same dignity that people everywhere deserve." He stood up, and this time Sarah knew the interview was over. "When you write your story," Traoré said, "I hope you will think about the questions you did not ask as much as the answers I did give. I hope you will consider whether the framework you brought to this conversation was adequate to the reality we discussed." Sarah stood as well, her legs unsteady. She felt intellectually exhausted, as if she had just completed a marathon of the mind. "Thank you for your time, Captain," she managed. Traoré shook her hand again, the same firm grip, the same penetrating eye contact. "Thank you for listening, Ms. Mitchell. Most journalists come here to confirm what they already believe. You at least seemed willing to consider that you might learn something." As he walked toward the door, Traoré paused and turned back.
"One more thing, Ms. Mitchell.
When you return to London, ask your editors why they sent you here with questions about Russian influence but not about British influence. Ask them why you were briefed on our military relationships but not on our economic relationships. Ask them whose interests are served by the stories you are encouraged to tell and the stories you are discouraged from investigating." With that, he was gone, leaving Sarah standing in the studio with Marcus and the rest of the crew, all of whom looked as shell-shocked as she felt. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The interview had lasted just over an hour, but it felt like they had traveled through decades of history and analysis. Sarah sat back down, her notes scattered and largely irrelevant to what had actually transpired. "Did you get all of that?" she asked Marcus weakly. Marcus nodded, but his expression suggested he was as overwhelmed as she was. "I got it all, but I'm not sure anyone's going to believe it." Sarah knew what he meant. The interview had been unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had been systematically outmaneuvered, not through hostility or evasion, but through superior knowledge and clearer thinking. She felt like an amateur who had tried to debate a master. But more than that, she felt like she had been exposed to a perspective that challenged everything she thought she knew about her profession, her country, and her world. The questions Traoré had raised were not easily dismissed, and the answers he had provided were not easily refuted. As she packed up her equipment, Sarah realized that she faced a dilemma. How could she report on this interview honestly without calling into question the entire framework within which she operated as a journalist? How could she present Traoré's arguments fairly without seeming to endorse positions that would be considered radical by her editors and audience? But even more fundamentally, how could she continue doing her job the same way after having her assumptions so thoroughly challenged? How could she ask the same superficial questions, accept the same comfortable narratives, ignore the same systemic realities that Traoré had laid bare? The drive back to her hotel was quiet, each member of the crew lost in their own thoughts. Sarah stared out the window at the streets of Ouagadougou, seeing them differently now. The poverty she observed was no longer just a sad reality to be reported. It was the result of specific policies and systems that benefited people like her while impoverishing people like those she was watching. That evening, as Sarah sat in her hotel room trying to write her story, she found herself paralyzed. Every sentence she wrote seemed inadequate to capture what had happened in that studio. Every conventional journalistic phrase seemed to trivialize the depth of analysis she had encountered. She thought about Traoré's final challenge, to ask her editors why certain questions were encouraged while others were discouraged. She realized that in 23 years of journalism, she had never seriously questioned the assumptions underlying her profession. She had learned to ask tough questions within acceptable parameters, but she had never questioned the parameters themselves. The story she eventually filed was technically accurate but somehow incomplete. She reported on Traoré's positions, quoted his responses, provided context about regional developments. But she could not capture the intensity of intellectual challenge she had experienced, the systematic deconstruction of her worldview, the uncomfortable recognition that her ignorance ran deeper than she had ever imagined. Her editors were pleased with the piece. It provided good quotes, clear positions, valuable insights into an important regional leader. But Sarah knew that the real story, the story of what had actually happened in that studio, remained untold and perhaps untellable within the constraints of her profession. Months later, as events in the Sahel continued to unfold, Sarah found herself returning again and again to that interview. She began reading books she had never bothered with before, exploring histories she had taken for granted, questioning narratives she had accepted without examination. She never saw Ibrahim Traoré again, but his words continued to echo in her mind. Not as the statements of a political leader to be analyzed and critiqued, but as the questions of a teacher challenging a student to think more deeply about the world around her. The interview that was supposed to reveal the thinking of an African strongman had instead revealed the limitations of her own thinking. The questions designed to hold him accountable had instead held her accountable to knowledge she didn't possess and assumptions she couldn't defend. In the end, Sarah realized, she had gone to Africa to get answers, but she had returned home with better questions. And perhaps, she thought as she stared at her computer screen late one night in London, perhaps that was the more valuable outcome after all. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in her own office now, casting the same harsh shadows she remembered from that studio in Ouagadougou. But everything else had changed. The questions that had once seemed so important now seemed inadequate. The answers she had once found satisfying now seemed superficial. Ibrahim Traoré had silenced her not through intimidation or evasion, but through education. He had rendered her speechless not by refusing to answer her questions, but by demonstrating that her questions were based on insufficient understanding of the reality they purported to investigate. And in that silence, Sarah had heard something she had never heard before, the sound of her own assumptions crumbling, replaced not by cynicism or despair, but by the uncomfortable and exhilarating recognition that there was still so much to learn, so much to question, so much to understand about the world she thought she knew so well.